Do Ontario's former premiers still stand by the policies they became known for? The Premier Files explores all of that and much more. Bob Rae was Ontario's 21st Premier and still the only New Democrat to lead the party to an election victory in history. I spoke to Mr. Rae at TVO about a life in opposition, with the exception of one shocking victory in 1990.
I, Bob Rae, swear that I will duly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Premier and President of the Council and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs of the Province of Ontario. So help me God. Okay.
Premier Rae, thank you for doing this.
Great to be with you.
You are different, I would suggest, from all of the other premiers that I'm talking to, because unlike them, your childhood was different. You had a father who was a high-ranking person in the public service of this country. So let's start there. Tell us about Saul Rae.
Well, with great pleasure. My dad was born on December 31st, 1914, in Hamilton, Ontario.
Good city.
On Cannon Street. His parents were immigrants. His father had been born in Lithuania and went to Scotland and fell in love with a Scottish girl, and they left Scotland and came to Canada. He came first, as often is the case, and then he brought his wife over with my aunt, Grace, who was a choreographer and a dancer, and my dad was born in Hamilton.
So what was your family's real last name?
Cohen.
How did it get to Rae?
Well, when you say what was my family's real last name is Rae, but my father's real last name was Cohen, and it became Rae in Canada when basically their families were divided, and he came here, and at the time in both the Jewish and Protestant communities in Scotland, this was not, these marriages were not celebrated in quite the same way. And so when they came to Canada, they became Rae. So there was a whole side of my dad that, I was born in 1948. By that time, he'd already been in the diplomatic service. He still played the piano a lot, wrote songs, and was very funny. He was a very funny man, as well as being a very serious man. And I think all his life he was kind of trying to balance these two things, the sense of he didn't want people to think he was only just a man with a sense of humor and could do shows, and he was a good singer, and he could tap dance. He was an amazing character, but he was a serious diplomat. He joined the diplomatic service after going to LSE on a scholarship after going to U of T, and he came back. He worked for the Gallup organization in Princeton, and then he came and joined the Foreign Service. And he joined the Foreign Service at the time the war broke out, so he was very much involved in Canada's coming of age, if you like, on the stage of global diplomacy, and that's what he was part of them. Mr. Diefenbaker used to refer to the group around Mr. Pearson as the Pearsonalities. He was one of the Pearsonalities. He was a personality. He definitely was.
Is there any question in your mind that his devotion to public service somehow made its way to you, and you wanted to follow somewhat his example?
No doubt at all, none at all. But I would also emphasize that my parents were a team. And I think coming of the generation that they did through the war, through the Depression, and my mother lost her father when she was 15, and she went to Cambridge when not many women went to university. She went to Cambridge, and she met my father before the war, and then they got married and so on. But yes, the public service is something that I definitely learned. We didn't talk a lot about, making money or doing things. Or public service was what I grew up with. That's what I knew.
Well, in fact, okay, so your dad was in Washington at one point.
Yes.
And you were too, obviously,
yes,
as his kid. And you end up being Richard Nixon's paperboy.
Yeah.
What's the story there?
Well, my brother and I, and another third guy named Billy Paulson, who still lives in Washington. I keep in touch with him. And we had a series of newspaper routes.
What year are we talking now?
56, 57.
So he's vice president.
58, he's the vice president. And in those days, the vice president lived nearby. And there was no official residence. And we lived on Quebec Street, and he lived a couple of streets over. And it was perfectly, Julie Nixon was in my primary school.
His daughter. You were in the same class?
We were in the same class.
Huh. Okay. You told me a story fairly recently, but let's get it on the record here, about how you were on a flight many, many years later. You saw Richard Nixon?
Yeah.
And you sent him a note, and what happened then?
Well, I sent a note to his bodyguard, or his security aide, who was traveling with him. He was out of office. But he was still introduced to the commercial flight as the president of the United States. So we all, there he was. And I said to Arlene, I'm not going to get this chance. I might as well just do this. So I had my card, identifying me as the leader of the New Democratic Party of Ontario. And I gave it to the guy, and I wrote on the back of the card, I said, I was the president's newspaper boy. And he looked at me and he went, when he showed it to Nixon, Nixon looked at me and said, oh. And so the guy came over and he said, okay, the president will see you, but only for a brief time. And you need to convince him that you were his newspaper boy. I said, sure, okay. So what was the paper? Washington Daily Star, Washington Daily News. Where did we live? And so I told him where he lived, where I lived. Where'd you go to school? Horseman Public School. And who's your teacher? Mrs. Mann. No relation to Horace Mann, by the way. And then he said, oh, so what year was this? And I told him the year. He said, yeah, that's right. Right. So you were, yeah. What are you doing now? So we started telling him, and he said, "Is that like a socialist party?" I said, "Well, social democratic." Started talking about stuff, and then we had a good talk about politics. He said, "You enjoy it?" I said, "I do." He said, "I loved every minute of it."
He said that.
Oh yeah.
Every minute of it?
Yeah, that's what he told me. I don't think that's true, but he said it was such a great life. And we chatted about, his achievements with China and other things that he'd done. Very brief. And then I left and we shook hands and I thought that was it. And then some weeks later, a box of books arrived at our house, which was all of Nixon's books. The
ones he wrote?
Six Crises and all the other books signed.
Did you keep them?
No, of course. I've given them away to the libraries, but yeah, absolutely.
So that visit turned out pretty well.
Yeah, it was an interesting one, yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
You went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, got involved in social work there. Was the plan always to come back to Canada and run for office?
No. I went through a kind of a rough patch after I did my, what's called an MPhil in what we now call an MPhil in politics, political theory. I came back, thought I might do a thesis, might do my PhD, and then I just hit a wall. I hit a kind of a wall, and I don't quite know how to describe it. And I went through a bad period when I didn't know what I wanted to do, or where I wanted to go, or where I wanted to be.
Well, I think you've called it a depression in your books.
Well, it was, yeah. It was a depression. I had help. I had a therapist. I had people helping me and trying to deal with it. I came out of it, and it took me a while to kind of figure out what is it that what was going on, and I learned a lot of things about myself. That was so I don't. When people say to you, how do you feel? I said no. I learned a ton from that experience. I learned about resilience and how that's such a critical quality in life. Not all good things don't go easily all the time. I mean, I know I was on a kind of upward trajectory. The only problem was I didn't know where I was really going, and at some point I had to sort that out. I also learned about how the word should and perfection are not good things for your mental health. It made a big difference to me to understand that. I talk a lot about it with my team now in New York. I talk a lot about it with people, with students, but I talk about it very openly and publicly, which at the beginning was not something I was very good at, but now I feel very comfortable doing it. And I think it's really important for people to know that you will find failure, and you will find these moments in life, and you will find these challenges, and you sometimes now, I mean, I'm not going to diagnose anybody, and I'm very careful to say, I don't know, you go and see a doctor, let them tell you how to deal with this. But I do believe, and I was just talking to somebody I saw the other day, and he said to me, "What's the most important lesson that you've learned?" And I said, "You've got to learn how to get back up, and your mental health is the most important thing."
Was part of getting back up running for office?
No.
At age 30?
No, it was going to.
Because that's pretty young.
It was going to law school.
Oh.
And getting through, just reintegrating into Canada, learning about Canada, embracing the pragmatism and the practicality of law school as opposed to, more abstract academic endeavors.
Do you want to be a lawyer?
Yeah, I did. I didn't plan on running when I was 30.
But you did.
I did because the opportunity arose, and the person who was resigning from his seat, John Gilbert, said, "I'm going to be named a judge tomorrow." Those are the days when, judges were made quick. And he said, "So there's going to be a by-election, and if you're interested," and Nora and I, his wife's name Nora and John Gilbert were big influences on me. I knew them for the legal aid work I was doing, and I said, "Okay, I'll do it."
How'd you know you were a New Democrat? Which you were then.
I was then. I became a member of the New Democratic Party in '75, I think it was. I went to the convention, at Broadbent's leadership convention in '75 as a delegate. And
but I asked partly because I think you were at the '68 Liberal convention as well, weren't you?
I wasn't. I was a member of the Young Liberals at the University of Toronto when I started. So
how'd you know?
I've like Churchill, I've not only ratted, I've re-ratted.
Yes.
So it's complicated. I think it was coming back. I mean, obviously my experiences in England had impacted me, not the theoretical ones, but the practical ones of looking at, how people were living and dealing with a lot of homeless people in London and trying to figure out ways of getting people housed properly and engaging with the legal aid center where I worked. Had a big impact on me. I mean, why is this happening? How can we deal with this? When I came back, Stephen Lewis was the leader of the new NDP provincially, and he had a big impact on anybody listening or seeing him as a political leader. And in '75, the NDP became the official opposition, which was in
Ontario.
Yeah,
yes,
it was a breakthrough.
Well, okay, because you won your seat obviously federally. You were a member of Parliament and finance critic. I mean, which is the best role to have if you're going to be in the opposition.
Yeah.
And then suddenly in 1982, which I guess is 4 years later, you give that up and you decide to come contest the NDP leadership in Ontario. Why do that?
Well, there's a story there. I mean,
that's why I'm asking.
the NDP got beaten up badly in the provincial election. Michael Cassidy decided to step down, and
this is the '81 provincial election.
The '81 provincial election, and when that happened, I can remember watching TV, and I said, Arlene said, "What's the matter?" I said, "I think I'm going to get a lot of calls." And I did. I started getting calls from people in Queen's Park and calls from the party and from trade union leaders and from a whole bunch of people saying, you've got to do this. Initially I was reluctant. It took me a long time to make up my mind. I wasn't 100% comfortable with it at all because I felt I was doing a good job where I was, and I didn't. But a couple of things happened. One is our daughter Judith was born, and we had to then figure out, well, I don't want to live away from my family. So we either moved to Ottawa or I moved back to Toronto. And so that had an impact on me, figuring out, how do we manage our lives together in that way. There was no pressure from Arlene one way or the other in terms of saying, no, you got to do this or that. None of that. None of my decisions have been like that. And I did get married in 1980. It's something you forgot to ask me about, because it's kind of a significant milestone in my life.
Was it?
Yes, it was a very significant milestone.
I think you got married shortly after. It was pretty close after an election,
yes,
wasn't it?
A few days after.
A few days after an election.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
because you had an election in '78, the by-election,
79.
a '79 federal election, another federal election in '80,
yes,
and then you got married.
Yes. And then we had a baby, and then I decided to run for the provincial leadership, and then I had a provincial leadership in '82, and then I had a by-election in '82.
And then another general election in 85.
Yeah. So
and despite all of
that's
that,
a lot.
you and Arlene are still married. Why would that be? I
No, you
wonder?
better ask her the reason.
What were your
But I'm a lucky man.
Yes, indeed. What were your expectations of how far you could take the Ontario NDP after winning the leadership?
Well, I mean, I think I came in with high hopes that I could make a difference, and I think it was the years between 82 and 85 were tough at a personal level, because I was not comfortable in my shoes. I would,
As a person or as a leader?
as a leader. I mean, and running a caucus and getting into managing a caucus it's not like anything you've seen. You've seen him. You know the difference between a caucus and a cactus, right?
Tell me. Oh,
Yes.
I do know. Go
A
ahead.
cactus, all the pricks are on the outside. Caucuses are difficult. You know, they're hard to manage, and you have to learn how to get along and how to work with them. And it was not easy for me, and it was very clear to me that Peterson was much more at ease with how he was doing.
The Liberal leader,
David Peterson, who was elected at almost the same time I was.
Right.
So there was a kind of natural competitiveness that was set up between us that that was very much part of those years. And with the two parties, we were always trying to get the leap on the other when whatever the particular crisis was. And in the end, David Peterson did better than I did in the 85 election.
Well, we're not there yet. Hang on,
Okay.
because Bill Davis is premier right now,
Yes,
and
he is.
frankly, it looks like neither one of you is going to have a shot to
That's true.
dethrone him. But then he steps down.
Yes.
The first clue that the script might be different was when Bill Davis arrived at Queen's Park with wife Kathleen and son Neil.
A very difficult decision to step down as leader of our party.
And Frank Miller takes over.
Correct.
What did you think the change of leadership in the Tory party might do to the dynamic politically across the province?
I thought it might help Peterson because I thought that I always saw David as a certainly very much a man of the center, and that might help to bring some people over from the Conservatives who were not necessarily completely comfortable with the way Frank Miller appeared to be wanting to take
Too
the
conservative.
Conservative Party. Too conservative, and I thought Peterson would have a shot. And I think as the election unfolded, it became very clear that he was doing well. And we didn't, as you may recall, we didn't have a debate.
Frank Miller would not have a leaders'
He would
debate.
not have a leaders' debate,
Yeah.
and so I didn't get an opportunity to do what I thought I could do reasonably well in. And so the election night came out, and the result was the Conservatives had the most seats, and then Peterson had
The most votes.
The most votes, and he had a few seats less.
But you were the kingmaker.
And we were in third place. So it was a combination of feeling, on the election night, was feeling sort of regret that we hadn't made the breakthrough that many people said, well, this could happen, and it didn't happen. We increased our support and we increased our seats, but we didn't do as well as everybody might have thought might happen. And then I realized as the election results coming in saying, this is going to be interesting. And I can remember many people said, well, the Tories have won a small plurality of seats.
It
And
was
they,
52-48 for them.
yeah.
And did you instantly understand that might make things tricky?
Yes.
And what did you interpret that to mean?
I interpreted it to mean that in my understanding of our constitutional democracy, parliamentary democracy, you don't get elected premier on election night, unless you've got a majority. Mm-hmm. And if it's a minority, you don't know who's going to be prime minister or premier until the House has decided who is going to have that job.
But of course, every other time this had happened, and this was not the first time, the third place party always supported the party with the most seats. That wasn't on for you?
No. And I mean, it wasn't automatic for me. I tried to hold back what I was sort of the turmoil in my head, but I felt very strongly that it isn't a given, and that after 42 years, and with Miller in the position rather than someone else, being more conservative, this wasn't the big blue machine. This wasn't the progressive conservative party that we knew from before in the same way.
No, he loved Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and all of
Yeah,
that.
it was. I liked Frank Miller. Everybody liked Frank Miller, and this, to be honest, this is one of the other features of politics in those days. It's important to remember. Politicians actually liked one another
In different parties.
in different parties, and cross party lines. And it was, there would be, you'd see people for dinner. It would be very common to engage with people in that kind of very friendly way, to understand when people were having a rough time, to know about, who had family members who were not well, or who was getting on with things. And there was just a lot of that kind of understanding. You felt you were part of a fellowship. That was true in the House of Commons as well, by the way.
Less true today.
Oh yeah, way less true
Yeah.
today, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, so you have to, at some point, I understood you took deputations from both the Conservatives and the Liberals as to whom would you thought be the better option to form the next government, and you ultimately decided to back the Liberals. And I just wonder if you could take us, I think it's 40 years later already, you can take us inside your caucus and tell us, was everybody on board for this, or how did it break down?
Well, we started out, the first thing we did is we had a meeting pretty quickly after the election. And that's one of the things that I'm not sure that was a great idea, but we did. And
You're not sure it was a great idea because?
well, you'll see as I tell the story. It'll become
Okay,
clear to you. These things like cake has to rise a little bit. You have to let it cook. The challenge for me was that I thought, my personal view was that we should form a government with the Liberals.
Coalition government?
Yes.
Where New Democrats would get cabinet seats?
Yes. And I had a discussion with David Peterson a day or two after the election. And the middle person was Hirsch Hazarin, because Hirsch had been at the UC Lit with me. We were to get pals then, back in college. And he phoned me and said,
he was Peterson's chief of staff at the time.
yes, and said, can we talk? Can we talk? And I said, yeah. Or I might have phoned him. I honestly can't remember. Hirsch would probably remember. And I said, I think it's important that we talk. And Hirsch said, I agree. So we'll have a conversation. So I had a conversation on the phone with David Peterson. And in that conversation, David Peterson said to me, we came very close. And I said, you came closer than you might know when you hear what I have to say to you. And we started chatting about, how it wasn't inevitable that the Conservatives would form power, that it had been 42 years, and there would be an opportunity to do things differently. But we'd have to figure out how to do that. On the basis of that call, I started talking to some of my team, and I could tell that some members of the party were getting worried that I was going to leap too soon to say this is what we're going to do. And so the first caucus meeting was people saying, let's hold back. And so that's when we created the strategy to say, okay, I'll take a step back, and Peterson will do the same. And so we created this process of teams, where we would have teams going in to speak to the other parties and engage with them about feeling things around about what would be possible and not possible. It became very clear to me that the caucus was really divided among a number of groups. Some wanted a coalition like me. I didn't say I never said to the caucus, I want a coalition. Didn't do that. I did say, let's not rule anything out yet. But the idea of a coalition to some members of the caucus was very hard to stomach.
Because?
They saw it as the party losing its identity, the party becoming, we would just become like them, or they felt that we might get more if we bargained with the Conservatives, and I made it pretty clear that I did not see the logic for us of propping up the Conservatives. I said, I think there's actually historic opportunity here for us to get rid of the government. So slowly but surely, we began to devise this thing called the Accord, which was basically a written agreement in which we would say that we would provide supply and confidence for a period of time in exchange for a variety of commitments that would be clearly set out in the Accord document. And we sort of shared the concept with both parties. Both parties said okay. And then we came back and I said, okay, guys, we've got to stop dancing here. We've got to decide who's our partner. Because otherwise we're just going to look stupid and people are going to say, well, you're talking to the other guys and you're talking to them, so let's do it. So I said, let's understand something. We could get, no doubt, a lot of things from the Conservatives, but we need to understand that that has bigger implications for where we would end up in the next election, with David Peterson saying, these guys here, look, you want them, they're holding up this bunch of reactionaries that are doing this, that, and the other thing in exchange for whatever. So he said, I said, we would be very vulnerable in the next election. I don't want to do that. Long story short, I've told this story much greater length than I thought I would. We did the deal with the Liberals.
And did you at any, well, I know there was a moment where you asked David Peterson, can we sign a document in public together to show that I'm going to support your government and we're going to bring down the Conservatives? And he said no.
That's right.
That tick you off?
Yes, of course it did. But it also made it clear to me that, thank you very much.
Thanks for making me premier,
Thanks
but
for
I'm
making me
premier
premier,
now.
but don't let anybody know that I made you premier. He was not interested. I believe that we played a critical role in making history and in changing what had you and I grew up. I'm a little older than you are. Grew up entirely assuming Conservatives would be there forever.
Well, because they were.
Because they were, and they'd been there for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was time to end the dynasty. It was time to end it. And to end it with stability, with not going into an uncertain situation, we needed to assure the Lieutenant Governor that if he didn't, that if Miller came to him and said, I've been defeated in the legislature, I'd like you to call an election, that he would have the wherewithal to say, well, maybe you would, but I'm going to ask Mr. Peterson if he can form a government, and I've been assured by the leader of the third party that in fact he's going to provide support to Mr. Peterson.
Well, let me pick up on that, because the fact is we had 2 years of, as you point out, stable government. There was an accord of agreed upon items that the Liberals passed with your backing. And then 2 years later, David Peterson, as was his right, called an election and was rewarded with the biggest majority government in Ontario history.
I was looking for the long game. I knew that there was a risk that Peterson would win a huge majority, but I also knew that we did, and I think the personal polling numbers and approval numbers would show that we actually gained a lot of credibility with the public because of the way in which we'd handled it. There were a lot of New Democrats who thought it was a mistake, and a lot of people said there, and frankly, there are many of my colleagues who lost their seats because we ended up having more seats and becoming the official opposition.
You came second, but you lost seats.
Yeah, we came second, but we lost seats, but we gained votes. I mean, not to get too complicated, but a lot of people said, this was really a serious mistake. I don't think it was. I don't think we'll ever know whether a coalition would have been better. I do think that supporting the Conservatives would have been unwise, and frankly, I just think it would have been not unwise, the wrong thing to do. It was time for a change. It was time for a new government. So when 87 happened and we were where we were, I felt we had a lot of work still to do on our policy stuff. There was a lot of conversations about new things and new steps we needed to take. And then the Meech Lake Accord was a factor in everybody's life, which began to put the Constitution more on the stage. And the Peterson government had a lot of issues about, I would call them character issues. I don't mean David Peterson's character. I just mean, you know, people making mistakes in judgment, a lot of ministers.
A lot of ministerial resignations.
Filing by the way, and people being resigned, major shuffles, people coming and going.
And the burden of high expectations. Huge
Very
caucus.
high expectations. And he frankly, the government between 85 and 87 was more productive than the government after 87 because they didn't, I always argued, maybe it was unfairly, they didn't have a script. We had the script. And so they didn't quite, you know, make the changes that people were looking for. And then you had this perception that the economy was changing. And then something happened in that I didn't see happening. Because the last thing I'd say to you is, I nearly ran for the federal leadership and when Ed Broadbent resigned after the 88 election. I was pressured by a lot of people, encouraged by a lot of people, thought about it long and hard. Came back from a flight from northwestern Ontario where I was doing some doing political meetings, and the caucus was there waiting for me, and I said, "It's okay. I'm not going to resign. I'm going to stay." And then I said, "But you know, we'll see what happens after the next election." And everybody agreed. So this, I thought myself, would be my last election.
1990.
Yeah, I was convinced it was going to be my last election, and that I had taken the party up to a certain level, and I felt if we could get 30% of the vote and we could get, you know, the seat count back up to a respectable number, and I could say that, you know, the party I'd been the leader for 8 years, and the party had gone a certain direction and moved up, and now I could step down and new leadership could come in.
So as the campaign is going on and your numbers are going up to levels you had never seen before, are you believing it? Like, what are you thinking at this time?
It was unbelievable. I mean, it's because, I mean, people forget in this day, and people talk about the last election federally and every other election. This election was one where David Peterson came out of the Meech Lake discussions a hero in the minds of many people. Certainly the chattering classes and the media saying, you know, statesman and giving away seats in the Senate and doing all this stuff and saying, well, do what needs to be done. And I was convinced that he was going to call an early election. I had been for quite a while. I warned the caucus on a few occasions that and I actually warned Mike Harris, and he didn't believe me because he'd just been named the leader. I said, Mike, he's going to call an election. He said, why? It's got 90, whatever, 80, whatever numbers, crazy numbers.
95 seats.
95 seats. And, you know, why's he going to do that? I said, because things are happening out there, and he wants to get off this and clear the air and go and do it. And because of the free trade agreement, the economic changes, high interest rates, a lot of things happening all at the same time, that drove public opinion in a direction that I don't think any of us expected. My overnight polling, the first election the NDP ever did overnight polling. We did overnight polling, rolling polling, we used to call it. And the first night of the rolling poll, David Agnew wouldn't tell me what the numbers were.
Your campaign manager.
Yeah,
Because?
he said, David Agnew is my campaign manager and my principal secretary, and later on secretary of the cabinet. And now the president of Seneca College, and a dear friend. And David said, oh, we haven't got them yet. I said, come on. You know, finally, at sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he said, here's the numbers. And they were terrible. We were like third. We were down in the low 20s. The Conservatives were in the mid-20s, and Peterson was in the high 40s. By the end of the first week, we were up to 30. And we couldn't believe it. The moment that I really sensed that we could actually win was when Peterson announced that he was going to drop the sales tax. Because I said, people don't do this unless they think they're losing. Because it didn't make, it was just, came out of the blue. Bob Nixon didn't even know when he did it.
He will tell you it was not his idea.
Not his idea.
He did not love that idea. on election night, when you win a majority government with a number that you're not really supposed to be able to win a majority with,
Yes.
right? 37.6%.
Right.
The results have just started coming in, but we are starting to see a trend. The NDP are on their way to victory. These are the returns as we have them right now. The NDP leading and elected in 66 seats around Ontario. They came in tonight with 19.
Do you remember what you said, the first words out of your mouth when you went to give your victory speech?
Well, you will not remember this. The first two words that I said were Cari, amici, which means dear friends in Italian.
Yes.
And I have, to this day, I have people saying, who is Gary Amici? Who's that? Was Don Amici's brother.
Okay.
And so my second words were, maybe a summer election wasn't such a bad idea. Because the summer election thing and the early election thing actually hung around like a bad aftertaste, much more than anybody thought. Most people thought, well, public will be mad for a couple of days, then they'll forget about it and the election will go on. But no, it was not like that.
Another thing that happened back in those days that never happens anymore is that whoever won the election would put on a set of headphones and do individual interviews with the anchors of all the different television broadcasts. And you and I did one that night. And I remember it very well because I asked a question that I thought was borderline, I don't know if I should ask this, but I did anyway. And the question was, Mr. Rae, you've had your share of tragedy in your life. You lost your parents to an automobile accident, your in-laws, excuse me, your wife's parents. Your brother, David, had died of leukemia. And do you think this is, in some respects, the universe's way of balancing the scales? And I know that people who were on the set with me were very, oh my God, what's he going to say? Do you remember what you said?
Something to the, I don't remember the exact words, but I was not offended by the question.
I'm glad to hear that, because when you gave the answer, I thought, he's okay with it.
Yeah.
And the answer was, I was just saying to somebody in my family earlier today that the Rae family was due to have a party.
Yes, that's right. We were due for a win, is what I think I said. Something
Okay.
like that.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, I felt that. I mean, you never, I mean, life is not about, you don't keep score. But it had been a rough 5 years in our family, in both Arlene's family and my family. And yeah, it was quite amazing. It was quite an amazing night, and it was astonishing, the emotion. Because as you know, in every election, even though you won 37.6% of the vote, the next day everybody voted for you.
Yeah, right. That's right.
How does the name Premier Bob Rae sound?
I'm having difficulty getting used to it. Just Bob sounds fine to me, but
How about Premier Bob?
well, it's an enormous responsibility, and I don't think anyone could have seen this election as we have without realizing that the public support can never be taken for granted, and I just think we've just got to do the best we can to keep on trying to earn it, and it's a very, very humbling experience.
Okay, so you have this night where Stephen Lewis described it as a night that exceeded my wildest fantasies. That's what he said. But then you have the reality of governing as a recession comes on. And how long did it take before, you got a pretty damn short honeymoon, as I recall. How long did it take for the realities of a very inexperienced caucus, a very inexperienced cabinet? You had no governing experience yourself. Did you feel you were ready to take on whatever was about to hit you?
Well, I think the honeymoon lasted for a while. Looking back historically, we had incredibly high approval numbers and, polling numbers for the first few months. It wasn't just weeks. It was the first few months.
Do you remember what you said to Floyd Logren when he saw your polls went from 37% to something like 50. And you remember what you said to Floyd when you walked into the house that day?
Oh.
Don't inhale.
Don't inhale. Well, I say it all the time. Actually went higher than that. And I think the trouble, the mistake that we made was not that we weren't ready, is that we were not clear enough with the public about what we knew the numbers were, the financial numbers. And because we had this thing about budget secrecy and and we didn't really know what to do as we were leading up to the first budget. I think we were okay moving on towards the first budget, but I think, which didn't come until after Christmas. But I think we felt that we were all weighed down by this knowledge that the floor had fallen out of the revenue base of the province, that we simply didn't have. It wasn't a spending crisis. It was a revenue drop. And I had people from the Treasury Department saying, "Never seen anything like it, Premier." I said, "Well, thanks, but And in Ontario, the thing that is really different from a federal government is that the one number that you know all the time in those days was your sales tax numbers, because you're collecting them on a regular basis and you're getting that. You can almost imagine somebody with a quill pen somewhere downstairs saying, "Oh, the numbers are down." But the numbers were down, and we've never seen a drop. There'd never been a drop in the revenues of the province since the Depression. So we realized that we were in a much bigger mess and soup than the public knew.
Did you instantly understand that meant that a lot of the promises that you had made, forget it, we weren't going to be able to keep them?
Well, actually, we were determined to try to keep some and to keep going as much as we could. I think the mistake we made, as I said, I think first of all, I think we should have figured out a way to publicize much more what the real state of was and how were we going to do this. And other premiers, I think, have been more successful, not just in Ontario, but in other provinces. Forget about budget secrecy. Forget about all the stuff that you're supposed to keep.
But you did. You went on TV and you gave a whole. You did a sort of like a prime time.
After.
Okay.
Not before the first budget.
Okay.
And then I think we began to feel that we had to do more. And I don't think we felt we had to give up everything. I think I felt certainly that we were in a different frame than we had ever been, and that we needed to really think through what that meant and how it would work. But I think the thing that you have to remember about our government is that we didn't just face one challenge, we faced three. The first challenge we faced was that we were new and that we were largely inexperienced. The second crisis was the constitutional crisis, which everybody forgets about. Because after the collapse of Meech Lake, which happened at the same time as our election was happening, the issue of separation was not a theoretical issue anymore. The support for separatism was at 65% in Quebec. I took this issue very seriously, and I realized very quickly that I was taking it more seriously than the Ontario public was, and caring more about it than the Ontario public really sort of thought this was top of mind. They were worried about one thing. They were focused on the economy. And these things all come home to roost, and they teach you lessons about what do people really care about and what don't they care about. And so I think that to me was an object lesson. So it wasn't just the inexperience, it wasn't just the economic crisis, it was also the additional factor of the constitutional issue, which frankly for the first 2 years of our government was a preoccupation for me, not exclusive to everything else, but it meant that I was thinking about that and having to cope with the other issues at the same time, which the first year was tough.
Yeah. I want to ask you about two things in particular, because two of the most significant decisions you had to make were whether to keep the commitment to go for public auto insurance and what to do about saving money when it became apparent that the bottom was really falling out of everything here. So let's start with auto insurance. On the first anniversary of your swearing in, you made the decision that this promise that had gained a lot of attention because it was novel and auto insurance rates were going through the roof, you made the decision not to go ahead with that after all. I mean, here we are, 34 years later. Would you do anything differently?
Honestly, Steve, I don't think so, because I think it would have been a huge diversion of effort for the government at a time when I was increasingly convinced as we were completing our first year that we really, really, really had to focus on the economic life of the province and what that required. I was spending a huge amount of my time dealing with plant closures, dealing with negotiations with unions right across Northern Ontario, de Havilland purchase, all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, I think people don't understand.
You saved Algoma Steel.
Saved Algoma
saved
Steel.
St. Mary's Paper.
So we've saved dozens
De
of
Havilland,
companies.
yeah.
A lot of great stuff. I mean, so we had to do that. And I said, I can't do that and then do this venture, which will take up an incredible amount of time and of my time. And I think I wouldn't, in practical terms, this is not a philosophical question. It's a practical question. Is this your priority right now, or is this your priority right now? And I said, this is not my priority right now. This is my priority. And there's no point in sort of woulda, shoulda, coulda. It needed, I think we needed to send a signal to the province and to public opinion that there were some things we had hoped to be able to do that we couldn't do. And there were other things that we didn't think we'd have to do that we do need to do.
The other huge decision you had to make was about how to save, was it $6 billion through the social contract?
Yeah.
I think it was $2 billion in tax increases, $2 billion in giving people what they ended up calling Rae Days, unpaid days off. We experienced them here at TVO. Opinion was split. Some people thought it was a good way to save jobs and money. Other people said you should have just fired 20,000 public servants and you'd have looked tough, and that would have been a better way to go.
There will be a social contract negotiated with our own employees. There will be a vigorous exercise in expenditure reduction. There will be a continuation of our commitments to investments in infrastructure and investments in jobs and in partnerships with the private sector. And there will also be revenue increases in the next budget.
In hindsight, how does it look 30 plus years later?
I think it's a classic example of something which was a policy success and politically a bridge too far. I think that from a narrow partisan perspective, we're elected as leaders of parties, and that's the way our system operates. Our base comes from our parties, and that's who we are, and that's how it works. And so you have to recognize that, for me, I think it was not an easy decision at all, because I knew that it would cost me the premiership.
How'd you know?
Because I knew that the party would be divided, and I knew that it would be very difficult for me to recover in order to allow the party to do better in the elections.
So then why not find a different alternative?
Because it seemed to me that this was the fairest approach, and kind of felt, that's too bad, it's tough, I don't like having to do it, but I do think it's a better way to do it. There's no question that, I don't want to say Rae Days are, that's a good name for them, but this was my call. I didn't have a whole bunch of cabinet ministers saying, we've got this great idea for you. It was among a number of options presented, and I said, let's try this. And don't forget, we had 6 months of negotiations with the unions to try to get them to accept. Now, what I realize now is that it was a bridge too far, because it's very difficult to expect a trade union leader to say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to give stuff up. That's not why people get elected. And
because she's got a constituency she has to respond to as
she's
well.
got to commit, exactly, and that's not, you can't sell it.
Yeah.
And Bob White warned me too. He was furious. There were a lot of labor
Head of the
leaders.
auto workers.
Yes, he was personally very angry, and he was very upset with me, and he felt that I had made a profound mistake, and for many trade unionists, asking people to give up what they had in their collective agreements in order to save jobs was not what they thought was right.
But I gather Bob White said to you, why don't you just default on the money that, default on the debt and let's start again.
Yeah, he did. But I'm not sure, to be fair to Bob, who's not with us, but I'm not sure he was totally kind of serious. But I think he was saying, it's really too bad that it's the workers who have to pay.
As you look back at your 5 years as Premier, is there any decision in particular you would like to revisit?
Well, I think it would be the social contract. I think it would be really, well, not so much the social contract in and of itself, but I think the revisiting would be, if I could wind the clock back, it would be to say, what could I have done differently in the first year and a half or 2 years that would have avoided the necessity to take such a major decision as the social contract when we took it. And I think it frankly took us too long to fully understand and embrace the consequences of the economic recession we were going through, or to think that we could come through it without having to make some very difficult decisions in public expenditure, and also in how we dealt with the revenue situation. I mean, we did some remarkable things. We did an amazing job on housing, for example. We did an amazing, which has now been abandoned by government since that time, and we're paying a huge price from the failure to deal with the affordability problem. We constructed more social housing as a government than any government in Ontario history. Nobody had done as much as we had done, as successfully as we had done across the board in building more co-op housing, building more affordable housing, creating the conditions which meant that we wouldn't have the level of homelessness. We didn't have that degree of homelessness in those days that we have today. There are other factors at work, but something I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of the work we did on equality and on breakthroughs in terms of equal pay for work of equal value, and the work that we did in understanding the challenge of equity, the challenge of fairness, the challenge of inclusion. We did stuff on race relations that no government did until Kathleen Wynne was elected. We did stuff on hiring and on employment equity that was not done. And I still have, frankly, I have a lot of people coming up to me and saying, I wouldn't be here, my mother would not have become a police officer if it wasn't for you. And they're right.
I'll give you another one. There's an LRT 100
Yes.
yards north of this station that still isn't working on Eglinton.
We started it.
You dug the tunnels, and the next government filled them in.
Exactly right. And
we would have had an Eglinton line 30 years ago.
Yeah, we would have. I mean, those are all true things. So when we look at the strategy was to save on the operating side and to increase the level of investment. That was the strategy. That was the right strategy. Were all the techniques that we used to get to that strategy the right ones? Maybe not. Maybe some of them were, too hard and hard to do. Certainly for an NDP premier, very difficult to do.
You are, I think it's fair to say, out of the 26 premiers that we have had, you've had the most interesting post-premier life of any of them. And the stuff you have done is really, it's a hell of a list. The Area Indian Inquiry, you were Chancellor at Wilfrid Laurier, you've written books, you've headed up that task force for Dalton McGuinty on post-secondary education. You had this little switching of parties from the New Democrats to the Liberals, became a Liberal member of Parliament going back again. You ran for the Liberal leadership at one point. You became the interim leader of the Federal Liberals. Chair of the Forum of Federations, special envoy to Myanmar. You're, as we say here,
Don't forget the symphony.
You saved the
and
Toronto
the Royal
Symphony.
Conservatory.
Look, and Burnt Church, and I know. Look, the list. We don't have enough time to go through it all. And as we sit here, you're the ambassador to the United Nations for Canada, the same job your father had. I could mention 24 other things. So let me ask you this: being Premier of Ontario, where does that rank on life's list of accomplishments?
There is nothing like leading a government and being able to make and help legislatures and help cabinet colleagues to make decisions that actually make a huge difference in people's lives. You don't have to ask other people. You don't have to say, I'm begging you. You don't have to write a letter. You don't have to lobby.
What time does the meeting start, Premier?
When you get there, sir.
The meeting starts when the Premier arrives. That's right. Yep.
And that's something that I really appreciated. I would have loved to have a second term. And I think I would have been a better Premier in the second term. I think I was okay. I think I was a good Premier, and I think the government that I led, which is the most important thing, it's not about me, had some incredibly talented ministers who did remarkable jobs in the work that they did, and made a permanent difference and made a real difference in the lives of people. And I'm really incredibly proud of that. So I would have to say that it's been my opportunity to continue to take chances to serve in other ways. One of the reasons why I've done so many things is I was out when I was 46 or 47, and I was done. And so then you say, well, that's pretty quick. And it was too young to sort of look back and say, how am I going to spend my retirement? No, I wasn't about to do that. But I'm extremely grateful for the chance to have been able to serve as Premier. And all in all, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I enjoy talking to the other former premiers about what we did and what we tried to do and some of the idiosyncrasies that are particular to the job. Through the lens of time, I don't have a bitter lens at all. I look back with a much more positive spirit than that. There were tough moments, but I think it's important to realize that, you know, when you're in politics, to be able to win and lead a government is a great honor. And I can remember one thing that Brian Mulroney told me when I was first elected. And, you know, he said a couple of things. And it was a really nice thing that he said. He said two things, Bob. The first thing he said was, you know, that night you had last night, you know, the celebration and the moment, he said, it doesn't get any better than that. It's a tough road down. Yeah, that's one thing. That's why, which was true. I mean, it's just, the fun is over. Like
September 6, 1990 was your best night.
That was it. That was the night. The second thing he said is, Premier of Ontario, eh? There are not too many of those. Nobody can take it away from you. And you won it fair and square. And no matter what else happens, you can say that's something that I did. And he said, that's how I feel about being Prime Minister. People say, well, you know, he didn't do a great job. I said, yeah, okay, so were you Prime Minister? So I was grateful for the opportunity.
Ambassador Rae, Premier Rae, I'm grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Good talking to you.
Pleasure.